The ruins we visit today are silent. We walk through broken temples and fallen columns, and we imagine the people who built them as figures of marble and myth. We picture kings on thrones. We picture priests at altars. We picture armies pouring across deserts toward glory. This is the ancient world as we have been taught to see it. A world of monuments and miracles, of pharaohs and emperors, whose names survived the centuries because they wanted to be remembered. But the monuments lie, not in what they say, but in what they leave out. Beneath the temples and the triumphal arches, beneath the carved boasts of conquering kings, the ancient world ran on something far less glamorous. It ran on systems, quiet, relentless, mostly invisible systems that decided who ate and who starved, who obeyed and who was punished, and how power could travel across distances so vast that a message might take weeks to arrive. The greatest empires in history were not held together only by the will of great men. They were held together by three forces that ordinary people lived under every single day and rarely controlled: fear, grain, and roads. Fear made obedience feel like the only option. Grain kept millions of people alive in cities that produced almost no food of their own. And roads carried everything that mattered: armies, taxes, orders, grain itself, and the long reach of a ruler who might be 1,000 miles away. Strip these three things from any ancient empire, and the palaces become useless. The crowns become decoration. The gods fall silent. What remains is the machine, and the machine is the real story. To understand it, we have to go back to the beginning, to the moment when human beings first gathered in numbers large enough that they could no longer feed, protect, or govern themselves the way they always had. For most of human history, people lived in small groups. They moved with the seasons, followed the herds, gathered what grew wild. A bad year was dangerous, but it was survivable, because a small band could move, split apart, or shrink. There was no granary to defend, no city wall to feed, no king to obey. Then, slowly, that changed. In the river valleys of Mesopotamia, along the Nile, in the plains of northern China, people began to settle. They learned to plant grain and store it, and the moment they did, everything became more fragile, not less. A city is a remarkable thing, but it is also a kind of trap. Thousands of people living together cannot survive on what grows nearby. They depend on harvests carried in from the surrounding fields. They depend on someone organizing the storage of food so that a good year can carry them through a bad one. They depend on protection from raiders, who know exactly where the wealth is now kept. The very things that made cities powerful, their size, their wealth, their permanence, also made them vulnerable in ways that wandering bands had never been. And so the first rulers were not simply the strongest warriors or the most beloved priests. They were the people who solved these problems, or claimed to. Someone had to decide how grain was stored and shared. Someone had to organize the digging of canals that kept the fields alive. Someone had to settle disputes before they tore the community apart. Someone had to make the rules and make people follow them. This is where fear enters the story. We tend to think of fear as something crude, the threat of the sword, the shadow of the executioner. But the fear that held ancient societies together was far more sophisticated than that. It was woven into law, into religion, into architecture, into the daily rhythm of life, until obedience felt less like a choice and more like the natural order of the world. Consider the most famous law code of the ancient world, carved into a tall pillar of black stone nearly 4,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. We call it the Code of Hammurabi, after the Babylonian king who had it made. At the top of the stone, the king stands before a god, receiving the authority to rule. Below, in column after column, are the laws, hundreds of them, dealing with debt, marriage, theft, property, injury, and trade. What matters is not only what the laws say, but what the stone itself was doing. It stood in a public place where people could see it. Most could not read it, but they did not need to. The message was carried by its existence. There are rules. The rules come from the gods through the king. Break them, and there will be consequences. Consequences spelled out precisely so that everyone understood the price of disobedience. The punishments were harsh by our standards, and historians still debate how often they were actually carried out as written. But the point of the stone may never have been perfect enforcement. The point was the certainty it projected, the sense that someone was always watching, that order was permanent, that the king's reach extended even into the small disputes of ordinary households. This was fear used as architecture, and rulers across the ancient world learned to build it into everything they made. Think of the great monuments, the pyramids of Egypt, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the palaces with their carved walls showing the king triumphant over his enemies. We admire these as art, and they are. But to the people who lived beneath them, they were also statements of power, so overwhelming that resistance felt unthinkable. A ruler who could command thousands of laborers, move stone across deserts, and raise a mountain made by human hands, was a ruler who could surely crush a single rebellious village without effort. The monument was the message. Look at what I can organize. Imagine what I can do to you. And then there was the most powerful source of fear of all, the one that needed no soldiers at all, divine authority. In Egypt, the pharaoh was not merely a king, but a living link between the human world and the gods, responsible for the order of the cosmos itself. To defy him was not just a crime. It was a kind of cosmic betrayal, a threat to the rising of the sun and the flooding of the river. In Mesopotamia, kings ruled on behalf of the gods, and the temples held both spiritual and economic power. In China, later rulers would speak of the mandate of heaven, the idea that the right to rule was granted by a cosmic order and could be withdrawn if a dynasty failed. When obedience is tied to the will of the gods, fear stops feeling like oppression. It starts feeling like piety. But here is the contradiction that ran beneath all of it. Fear is powerful, but fear is also brittle. A population that obeys only because it is afraid is a population always calculating, always watching for the moment. The watchers grow weak. Fear could hold an empire together, but it could never make people love it. And when the other systems failed, when the grain ran out, when the roads grew dangerous, fear alone was never enough to save a throne, because no amount of fear can feed a hungry city. This brings us to the second great system, the one that decided more than any battle, whether an empire lived or died. Grain, it is difficult, in a modern world of full shelves and global shipping, to grasp how completely ancient life revolved around the harvest. There was no backup. There was no importing food from across the world in a matter of days. If the harvest failed, people starved, and not in some distant abstract sense. Children, parents, whole villages. The line between a full granary and mass death could be a single dry season. Picture a farmer in the Nile Valley, standing at the edge of his field in the weeks before the flood. Everything depends on the river. Each year, the Nile rose and spread across the land, leaving behind dark, fertile soil that made Egyptian agriculture among the most productive in the ancient world. If the flood came too high, it could destroy. If it came too low, the fields would not yield enough, and hunger would follow. So the farmer watched the sky and watched the water and prayed. His entire life, the life of his family, the life of his village, hung on forces he could not control and barely understood. The Egyptian state understood something crucial about this rhythm. The same river that fed the people could be measured, recorded, and taxed. Officials tracked the height of the flood because the height of the flood predicted the size of the harvest, and the size of the harvest determined how much the state could take. Scribes recorded the yields. Grain flowed into vast state granaries, storehouses that could hold the surplus of good years against the famine of bad ones. This was not charity, it was control. The state that held the grain held the power of life itself, because in a year of shortage, the granary was the difference between survival and death. Now picture a scribe, somewhere in a temple complex in Mesopotamia, bent over a clay tablet, pressing wedge-shaped marks into the wet surface. He is counting grain, so much received from this field, so much owed by that household, so much distributed as rations to laborers and soldiers. Thousands of these tablets survive, and they tell us something profound about the ancient world. Some of the earliest writing humans ever produced was not poetry or prayer, it was accounting. People learned to write, in part, so they could keep track of grain. The temple economies of early Mesopotamia ran on these records. Vast organizations that collected, stored, and redistributed food, that employed workers and paid them in measured rations of barley and oil. This is one of the great quiet truths of ancient civilization. Behind every god-king and every conquering army stood an army of scribes, counting. Glory was carved in stone, but power was recorded in ledgers. The dependence on grain only deepened as cities grew, and no city revealed this more clearly than Rome. At its height, the city of Rome may have held around 1 million people, an almost unimaginable concentration for the ancient world. 1 million people who grew almost none of their own food. To feed them, grain had to be brought in by ship from across the Mediterranean, especially from Egypt and North Africa, in quantities so vast that the entire system of supply became a permanent concern of the Roman state. The Romans gave this system a name, the annona. It was the organized supply of grain to the city, and at times the distribution of grain or bread to its citizens, sometimes at reduced prices and sometimes free. To us, this might sound like generosity. To Roman rulers, it was something closer to survival. Theirs as much as the people's. A hungry Rome was a dangerous Rome. Bread shortages could turn into riots, and riots could turn into the fall of governments. The emperors knew that the loyalty of the city was tied, in a very direct way, to the loaf of bread in an ordinary family's hands. Control the grain, and you controlled the mood of the capital. Lose control of the grain, and no monument, no army, no claim of divine favor could keep the peace. Imagine that ordinary Roman family, then, in a crowded apartment block in the city. Their lives were shaped by something happening hundreds of miles away that they would never see. The loading of grain ships in distant ports, the winds that carried them, the harvests of fields they would never walk. When the ships came, there was bread. When the ships were late, when storms scattered the fleet, or a harvest failed across the sea, prices rose, tempers rose, and fear of hunger crept through the streets. The grandeur of Rome, the temples and the forums and the marble, all of it rested on the fragile arrival of ships full of grain. So we see the contradiction again, sharper now. Grain was survival, but grain was also taxation. The same harvests that kept people alive were the harvests the state took to feed its armies, its officials, its cities. The farmer who watched the sky did not keep all that he grew. A portion went to the granary, to the temple, to the tax collector, to the distant capital. Empires were built on this flow of food from the many who grew it to the few who controlled it. And that flow had to move. Grain in a field in Egypt was useless to a soldier on a frontier, 1,000 miles away unless something could carry it there. Which brings us to the third system, the one that tied the other two together, and without which neither fear nor grain could reach across an empire. Roads. We think of roads as simple things, paths for travel, ways to get from one place to another. But in the ancient world, a road was an instrument of power, perhaps the most important one an empire could build. A road carried armies to the frontier before a rebellion could spread. It carried tax collectors out to the villages and the tribute back to the capital. It carried messengers bearing the orders of distant rulers, officials going to govern far provinces, merchants moving goods, and grain moving from where it grew to where it was needed. A road was the nervous system of an empire, the thing that allowed a single will at the center to be felt at the edges. No, ancient people understood this better, early on, than the Persians. The Persian Empire, which arose more than 2,500 years ago, was the largest the world had yet seen, stretching across an enormous span of territory and dozens of peoples. To hold something that vast together required a way to move power quickly, and the Persians built it. The most famous example is the Royal Road, a great route running from the heart of the empire toward its western edge, a journey that might take an ordinary traveler many weeks on foot. But the empire did not rely on ordinary travelers for its most urgent business. Along the road, at regular intervals, the Persians established stations with fresh horses and riders waiting. A message could be passed from rider to rider, from station to station, day and night, covering the entire route in a fraction of the time it would take a single person. The Greek historian Herodotus described these messengers with a kind of awe, saying that neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness stopped them from completing their appointed course. Long before the modern world, the Persians had built something like a postal relay across an empire, a way for the king's word to travel almost as fast as a horse could run. Think about what that meant for control. A governor in a distant province knew that the king could learn of trouble and respond faster than rebellion could organize. Distance, which had always been the great enemy of empire, had been partly conquered, not with weapons, but with roads and horses and organization. The road was not glamorous. It did not inspire poems the way a victory in battle did. But it may have done more to hold the empire together than any single army ever could. The Romans took this idea and made it the foundation of their world. Roman roads are still famous today, and for good reason. They built them to last, layered and drained and paved, cutting in long straight lines across the landscape. At its height, the Roman road network stretched for tens of thousands of miles, binding together territory that spanned from the cold edges of northern Europe to the deserts of the Middle East and the coast of North Africa. Along these roads stood milestones, carved markers that recorded distances, and sometimes the name of the emperor who had ordered the work, so that even the road itself reminded travelers who ruled the world they walked through. Picture a Roman soldier on one of these roads, marching with his unit toward a distant frontier. Beneath his feet is the engineering of an empire. The road lets him and thousands like him move with a speed and reliability that an enemy without such roads could not match. The same road that carries him will later carry the supplies that feed him, the pay that rewards him, and the orders that command him. And when his campaign is done, the road will carry the news of it back to Rome. The genius of the system was not any single road, but the network, the way every part connected to every other, so that power and food and information could flow wherever they were needed. Yet here we find the same haunting contradiction once more. A road built to carry an empire's armies outward could just as easily carry an enemy's armies inward. A road that let the center control the edges also let the edges reach the center. The Romans built the finest roads in the ancient world, and in the empire's later centuries, those same roads would help invaders move swiftly into the heart of Roman territory. The road was connection, and the road was vulnerability. It bound the empire together, and it offered a path straight to its core. And there was another kind of road that ancient empires built, one made of water. In China, successive dynasties invested enormous resources in canals, artificial waterways that allowed grain and goods to be moved by boat across great distances. Moving heavy cargo by water was far more efficient than hauling it overland, and a well-built connect the grain-producing regions of the country to the cities and the armies that needed feeding. The greatest of these projects linked distant parts of China together, and the labor required to build them was immense. Vast numbers of workers were conscripted, and the human cost of such projects could be severe. Here again we see the pattern. The same system that strengthened the empire and fed its people was built on the backs of laborers who had little choice in the matter, and whose suffering rarely made it into the official records of imperial achievement. For China, like Persia and Rome, was bound together not only by roads and canals, but by something less visible and just as essential: bureaucracy. The Chinese imperial state developed one of the most sophisticated systems of administration in the ancient world. A vast network of officials who collected taxes, kept records, enforced laws, and carried the will of the emperor into the provinces. Taxation flowed inward through this system, in grain and goods and labor. Orders flowed outward. The empire functioned, when it functioned well, because thousands of educated officials kept the machine running, counting, recording, organizing. The same quiet work that scribes had done in Mesopotamia thousands of years before, now grown into an entire profession that held a civilization together. Step back, and a pattern emerges across all these empires, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Mesopotamia, Egypt, Persia, Rome, China. Different gods, different languages, different kings. But the same three systems underneath them all. Fear to ensure obedience. Grain to sustain life. Roads to move power. The faces at the top changed. The machine beneath stayed remarkably the same. And living inside that machine, in every one of these societies, were ordinary people whose names we will almost never know. The farmer watching the flood. The scribe counting barley by lamplight. The soldier marching on the paved road. The merchant passing through a checkpoint where an official examined his goods and took the empire's share. The family in the city, listening for news of the grain ships. The villagers gathering their tribute, knowing that what they handed over might be the difference between their own survival and starvation in a hard year. The laborers, often working under compulsion, who dug the canals and raised the walls and built the very roads that carried the power that ruled them. These were the people who actually lived the systems that history books summarize in a sentence. They felt every tax, every shortage, every demand from a distant capital, in the most personal terms imaginable. Hunger, exhaustion. Fear we should be honest about the weight of that life. To be an ordinary person in an ancient empire was to live with very little control over the forces that shaped your existence. You did not decide the tax rate. You did not control the harvest. You could not vote out a king or appeal an unjust law to a higher court that would listen. You lived under systems designed, above all, to be obeyed. And yet these same people endured. They raised families, kept faith, told stories, built lives in the narrow spaces the systems allowed them. The endurance of ordinary people may be the most underappreciated force in all of ancient history. The monuments remember the kings. But it was the patience and labor and quiet persistence of millions of forgotten people that actually kept civilization standing. Which raises the question that haunts the end of every empire. If these systems were so powerful, why did they ever fail? The answer lies in the contradiction we have traced again and again. The very systems that made empires strong also made them fragile. Each was a kind of dependency. An empire that depended on fear could be undone the moment people stopped being afraid. An empire that depended on grain could be brought to its knees by a few failed harvests or a disrupted supply line. An empire that depended on roads could be invaded along the very routes it had built. Strength and weakness were not opposites in the ancient world. They were the same thing, seen from different angles. Consider how collapse tended to unfold. It rarely came as a single dramatic blow, a final battle that ended everything at once. More often, it came as a slow unraveling of the systems. Perhaps a series of poor harvests strained the grain supply, and prices rose, and hunger spread, and with hunger came unrest. Perhaps the cost of defending vast frontiers grew so heavy that the state demanded more and more in taxes, until the burden on ordinary people became unbearable, and their loyalty turned to resentment. Perhaps the roads grew unsafe, plagued by banditry or cut by invaders, so that grain could no longer move, and orders could no longer reach the provinces, and the center lost touch with its edges. Perhaps the fear that had held everything together began to fade, as people saw that the watchers were weaker than they had seemed. When one system faltered, it strained the others. A grain shortage could spark unrest that fear could no longer contain. Unrest could make the roads dangerous, which made grain harder to move, which deepened the shortage. The machine that had run so smoothly in good times could turn against itself in bad ones, each failing part dragging down the others. Historians debate the causes of any particular collapse, and they are usually many and tangled, climate and disease and politics and war all woven together. But beneath the specific causes, the deeper pattern is often the same. The systems that fed, frightened, and moved an empire stopped working. And once they stopped, no amount of past glory could hold the structure up. This is the quiet tragedy at the heart of ancient history. The empires that seemed eternal, that built monuments meant to last forever, that claimed the favor of the gods themselves, were in the end as fragile as a harvest, as vulnerable as a road, as brittle as fear. The marble outlasted the systems. The temples still stand, in ruins, long after the granaries emptied, and the roads fell silent, and the messengers stopped writing. We mistake the surviving stone for the source of the strength. But the stone was never what held the world together. What held it together was the flow. Fear moving from the throne into the minds of millions. As long as these things flowed, the empire lived. When they stopped, the empire died, no matter how grand its monuments or how proud its kings. So when we walk through the ruins now, we might try to see past the silence. We might imagine the fields beyond the broken walls, heavy with grain that someone counted and someone carried away. We might imagine the roads stretching to the horizon, worn smooth by soldiers and merchants and messengers, each one a thread in a web that bound a world together. We might imagine the ordinary people, the farmer and the scribe and the soldier and the family waiting for bread, living their whole lives inside systems they did not build and could not change, and enduring anyway. The ancient world was not held together only by heroes, or by gods, or by the monuments we still admire. It was held together by systems that fed people and frightened people, that moved people and controlled them. Fear gave it order, grain gave it life, roads gave it reach, and the people who lived beneath these systems, mostly unnamed and unremembered, carried the true weight of civilization on their shoulders. When the fear faded, when the grain stopped moving, when the roads were no longer safe, even the greatest empires the world had ever seen began, slowly, and then all at once, to fall. And in their silence, in the ruins we still visit, there remains a lesson as old as the first city and as relevant as the world we live in now. That what truly holds a civilization together is rarely the part we choose to remember. It is the quiet machinery beneath, the supply and the order and the movement, and the endurance of the ordinary people who keep it all alive.